Welcome, everyone, to the Ontology Summit 2024 Fall Series. Um, the just let me add, this is October 11th, 2023, and we're pleased to have Deborah McGuinness as our speaker, and I'll pass it over to our session chair, Andrea, who will do the introduction. Andrea?
Well, thanks, Ken, and thank you so much, Deborah, for doing this. I'm really looking forward to the talk. Its name, as you can see, is The Evolving Landscape of Generative AI, Ontologies, and Knowledge Graphs. And just as a little background, I think most of you, almost everybody should know who Deborah is, but she is the Tetherless World Senior Constellation Chair and a professor of computer, cognitive, and web sciences, as well as a professor of industrial and systems engineering at RPI. She's the founding director of the RPI Web Science Research Center. She's done so much work in explanation, knowledge engineering, ontologies, provenance, and methodologies for creating deployed applications. Her applications touched a wide range of areas, including precision health, exposure science, wireless spectrum, material science, as well as wine and food pairings. We all know that wine and food ontology, just to name a few. She's a fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the recipient of the Robert Inglemore Award from AAAI for leadership in semantic web research and in bridging artificial intelligence and e-science. She's the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Knowledge Graph Conference. That just happened recently, for outstanding contributions to the field of knowledge engineering. Deborah leads so many research efforts and has a wonderful team and has done so much work prior to joining RPI. I'm not going to go into all of that, but we are so honored to have Deborah as our speaker today, and I want to turn it over to you, Deborah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that nice introduction. That's very beautiful. And I'm really thrilled to be here today. I was a pretty active participant in Ontolog years ago, but I don't know, life got too busy and somehow I haven't been in too many Ontologs lately. So it was really fun to be back, and it was fun to be on early and watch all the names come in. I'm like, oh yeah, my friend from like 5 years ago. Oh, my friend from 10 years ago. Anyway, I've been on kind of a speaking tour, as I presume many of us who have literacy in AI. And I really feel like the world is changing at a pace that I have not experienced before. And I'm going to expose my age in that I took my first artificial intelligence class when I was an undergraduate at Duke in 1978. And I've been enamored with AI ever since. And following it, and active in research and industrial research as well. And I've never seen this kind of change in a related field. So I think, my main message, everybody tells you when you give talks that you should tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So, my main message is that I think we need to partner with these emerging technologies when it makes sense. And not partnering is probably a big risk. And I'm going to give a couple of examples where I think partnering is worthy and interesting and worth many of our time. Okay, I gotta figure out the best way to move forward. That work. Oh, I just added a slide. All right, what's the best way to move?
Well, could you maybe go into presentation mode to make it easier to read? And then I think
you're not seeing presentation mode, because I am.
No, I think we're seeing your background slide with all kinds of other things behind it.
So you don't see DLM background, ontologies, knowledge graphs, provenance, knowledge portals, hybrid AI systems?
No. We see click to add title and then some other things off on the side.
Oh, that's, huh. I wonder,
House is where your editor is for creating slides.
Yep.
I just,
We need is
at the beginning.
That should do it.
other windows on your desktop have to be closed and only the presentation has to be shared. Right now we are sharing multiple windows.
I'm sharing multiple windows. Oh my God, that's not good. All right, you know
What
what? I'm gonna
screen is
stop
probably
sharing.
a second
You
screen
stop
that it's
sharing and
projected
then
to.
share exactly what you want shared.
All right, and actually I'm gonna close down. I left a couple of other PowerPoints open because I thought that they might be worthwhile. Let's get rid of that.
Yeah, we were seeing all those PowerPoints.
You're seeing all the PowerPoints. That's
Well,
really-
well, you know, they were ones covering others. Windows were covering other windows, but that was the screen we were seeing. So it looks
Alright.
like you shared your desktop and what we got was your default desktop.
That is really interesting. All right, so I am going to try again. I closed down the other PowerPoints and I'm going to try again. And hopefully, oh, yeah, okay. Hopefully this works better.
Now that's the right PowerPoint. So maybe if you go into presentation mode, that'll do it.
Now, what do you see?
Well, we see both the overview on the left of the screen, the main presentation, and always use slide share. So maybe if you scroll, I'm not seeing where your presentation mode is.
It may be detecting or creating a fake second screen, and then that's the one that's not being shared. But I don't know how to make Zoom share that second screen.
Ron Ross is saying bottom right.
Bottom right. That was a cat meowing in the background. Bottom right. Well, I see slideshow. You are screen sharing. And then I'm clicking forward on the screen share, and that's not doing the right thing.
No,
Well-
there's a second screen that we're not seeing that PowerPoint is broadcasting to. Like if you had a projector up or something, it would do the same thing.
Huh.
The trick is to make Zoom share that second screen.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing again. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the PowerPoint. And I can kill that. I'm going to move the PowerPoint to screen 1. Maybe that'll help. I've never had this before, and I can't even count the number of presentations that
If
I've
you've
given.
got a screen 1 and a screen 2, then when Zoom says share, you either choose the whole of one of those screens or choose the application or something. It's terribly
All
confusing.
right, so
You got 2 screens.
we
That's why we're
we'll
only speaking about-
try one more time. Share
And-
screen.
And if it doesn't work, Deborah, I have your slide deck downloaded. I can share mine and put it in presentation mode.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna. I moved the PowerPoint to a different screen and thinking that might help. And otherwise, I'll just have you share.
It looks like it says always use subtitles. So I'll just jump in and share, and then you just tell me when you want to advance it.
All right, sorry. I
Oh.
don't usually have trouble.
Not a big deal. And I am going to share this one and share, and hopefully
Yep, you got it. And go to slide 2.
And let me
Yeah,
stop.
I was seeing that. Yeah, okay.
And you're seeing this, right? What I'm showing here.
Well, I'm seeing notes and stuff.
Yeah, I'm just gonna share my desktop and then switch right to that. Okay.
It's
And
PowerPoint
that
files and
that will
PowerPoint.
make everything go away. I hope. Oh, wait, stop this one. End show. There we go. End
Oh,
show.
maybe that's what was wrong with me. I didn't end the show. I just X'd it out from the top right.
Okay, go here, and here we go. This should do it.
No, still it is showing, yeah.
It's
No,
still
no.
showing that. I don't know. Well, let's just, maybe we should just
PowerPoint is
go.
trying to be helpful and thinks you're standing at a lectern with a screen behind you when you're not. And PowerPoint's
Yeah.
a bit of Zoom because it's entirely PowerPoint's fault. So
Well, you can do it in this mode, just like shrink the left column down and yeah, and then you could also shrink the notes down.
Yeah, let me just see if this does anything if I do this, because I stopped the show. No, it just wants to do this weird show. Okay. I'll shrink everything down and then.
Never had this problem before.
well, there were important updates last
There's
night.
some AI in here, like messing with it. There's all these gremlins. All right, well, this will work. So actually, Andrea gave a great background. I often throw something like this up just to show that I've done foundational work in ontology languages, but a lot of applications as well. So I kind of run this whole spectrum. And yeah, I am kind of famous for that wine and food pairing thing. And we'll hear a little bit more about that. Let's just go to the next slide. So, you know, probably everybody on this call is like acutely aware of how the AI landscape is. Oh, somebody, I just went to a view option of 100% that shows the central slide window. Well, I can work with this. I think we probably spent enough time on it. And, you know, I do believe that LLMs are transforming the world. And I just gave a talk to business leaders in the capital region where I live. And I left them with the message that it can change almost every aspect of technological business. You know, everything that doesn't need a physical presence and some things that can be replaced with physical presence. So it's time for us to really think about how it should change our research. And I'm going to give a few examples of the way it's changing mine and pose some questions for the way that it might change our field. Next slide. So, you know, they're also passing these tests at amazing speed and amazing numbers. But, you know, none of us are really going to go to ChatGPT to be our medical doctor or to be our lawyer. But, you know, for a lot of everyday things, they can really do a great job. But, you know, somebody, oh, I was just reading a post that John Soa had, somebody responded to his post in the Ontolog forum from a couple of days ago, where he points to, you know, one of the many books that he's written and one of the many chapters that he's written, where he had this beautiful quote that I should have written down about, you know, it makes sense to use them when you really understand them. So understand their strengths and their weaknesses. So they're fantastic at basically regurgitating information, which is what they're doing with these tests. Next slide. But, you know, does it really matter that they can pass these tests? So I like this quote that, you know, really it's regurgitation of material. And although they look like they can synthesize, they're not really synthesizing, as, you know, probably everybody on this call knows. What they're doing is they're trained on a lot of material, some of which has already synthesized other material. So it appears that they're synthesizing, but they don't really synthesize. So, you know, let's use them for what they're good at and use our technologies and other technologies for the things that they're not good at. Next slide. So do they understand? No. You know, so, you know, there's a few questions. When can and should we trust the results? Well, they often are usefully wrong. I mentioned to some people before the big group started that I've been doing a lot of talks, and a lot of like vision talks, you know, opening keynote to try to be that gray beard in the room, but hopefully it's not gray yet, and hopefully there's no beard there yet, to try to sit back and say, you know, where are we going, and what would be useful if you're picking a PhD topic, or what would be useful if you're trying to get a patent or something. So I was listening to a podcast from Microsoft, and they were saying they often are usefully wrong. And I like that phrase, that, you know, there's interesting information that they often can give you that might make you think. So can they tell us how they came to the answer? Not really. They can do the step-by-step stuff, which is kind of interesting, but it's not really how they came to the answer. Can they provide context in which their recommendations are reliable? No, not really. But this is a place where the ontolog world, what if the training set is not representative? Yes, yes, yes. Super good question. Yeah, well, you know, the training set is never perfect. It's biased, it's incomplete in certain areas, it's overrepresented in other areas. So how do you make sense of that? So how do you make sense of the context in which they were trained, and how do you make sense of their ability to say how reliable they are? You know, now if you ask them questions, they're starting to have like guardrails around them saying, oh, I can't really answer that, or just a reminder, I've only been trained up to a certain time period. But there's many opportunities for semantic approaches, especially ontologies and knowledge graphs. And I'm going to give, oh, did you go forward or back? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to give a forward pointer to something that I'm not going to have time to talk about today, especially since we spent so much time because of whatever happened in my presentation. But I gave a talk at Voice, Formal Ontologies and Information Systems, where I highlighted 11 different opportunities, and I gave an example of each of those opportunities. So those slides are at the end of this deck, but I wanted to do this a little bit as a conversation. And I wanted to pose a couple of questions and then show a couple of examples where I and my group are playing in these sandboxes to explore. Yeah, cool. Okay, Robbie's posting a lot of questions that are just popping up that look cool. So, you know, there is a hype cycle. Where are we in the hype cycle, and how might it inform our research? That's one thing that I'm going to spend a couple minutes on. How might we leverage large language models, foundation models for ontology and knowledge graph work? And I'm going to give a wines example. And then how might we create sandboxes where we can do exploration? You know, one of the many programs that I'm in, the DARPA Machine Common Sense program, we're in, I think, year 4. And Dave Gunning, who I think is one of the best DARPA program managers I've ever worked for. I worked for him in, I think, 4 or 5 different programs. He set up all these benchmarks. And then we did the kickoff meeting, day 2, he retired. Those benchmarks, the language models were killing the benchmarks. I think at 6 months, they were killing the year 3 benchmarks. And I was in there to do a common sense knowledge graph. Well, we didn't really need it for the benchmarks, but, you know, clearly we need better benchmarks. And is it just a benchmark, or is it really like a sandbox where you can really explore? And then one thing that I'm asking myself is, should we, or when should we, update some of our writings? You know, I'm a little bit famous for this book on ontology engineering, and I'm definitely a little bit famous for the Ontologies 101 tutorial that built off of my wines and foods ontology. You know, should those get updated? Well, I think the answer is probably yes, but how and when? Okay, next slide. So this hype cycle, I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but at the peak of inflated expectations, guess what's there? Generative AI. And in the trough, not quite at the bottom of the trough of disillusionment, is the knowledge graph area. So I pulled out the note the knowledge graph place. You know, and also this, I don't know whether Gartner always does this, of these timeframes. So it puts these timeframes on each of the dots. And the time frame for knowledge graph is in blue, so 2 to 5 years. It thinks that if you follow this cycle, it hit a plateau of productivity, which actually I think is kind of good. You know, that might be an opportunity where we can say the large language model hype or generative AI hype, you know, clearly they need something that knowledge graphs are good at, like the context and the relationships and the semantics. So this might be, you know, just kind of an opportunity made in almost heaven for knowledge graphs and of course ontology enabled knowledge graphs to shine. And so I'm going to explore a little bit about that in the next series of 5 or so slides. So next slide. So yeah, I'm famous for this wine and food ontology. And I'm going to say, what if we look at collaborative knowledge graph generation? And what if we look at my experience? So I built this wines and foods ontology literally in 1984 when I was taking an expert systems class at Rutgers. And I needed to do something that, you know, I could be my own expert in. And actually at the time I was living with a wine distributor. So I really used him as the expert. And we were, you know, very focused on doing a wine and food pairing project. And actually it was an expert system that the next year I translated into a description logic ontology. And so if we look at how I built it, and then I built out a knowledge graph or a knowledge base from that. And then if we look at Jans Osman's explorations, I love Jans. So Jans is the CEO of Franz Inc. And he decided that he was going to play around with large language models and say, what if I try to replicate, what if I try to build a wines ontology? Or actually, what if I just try to build a wines knowledge graph? And so I've used this wines ontology, you know, since 1984 to teach people to be at the basis of the W3C recommendation for how to use OWL. For Ontologies 101. So I've used it for decades to teach. And then somebody, when I was at RPI, decided to name it the semantic sommelier, some journalist, which I love that name. Now I'm attached to the name. But, you know, I built it to do a particular thing and I made it really small. And actually one of the reasons that I think it's lived on is because it is really small and the ontology itself has very little information in it that changes. So like I didn't put ages, years on the wines, I didn't put prices on the wine. Next slide. And so how did I do it? Actually, this is from a paper that I wrote in 2011 for Ontologies Come of Age, that the base ontology is super simple. I wanted to do a wine and food pairing application. And, you know, kind of the simplest way you do that is body, color, flavor, and sugar. And then we need a little bit of information about the wines itself. And it stood this test of time. It's been used all over the place. It's been translated, and actually the OWL guide is pretty heavily used, and the Ontologies 101 has been translated into, I think, 7 languages now, but it doesn't scale. Oh, and actually, I did this for about a decade. Every time I got a new graduate student, I said, here, you know, do something fun with the wines ontology. So somebody, you know, got a phone and said, okay, I'm going to do a mobile app, and I'm going to deploy it for making recommendations in Troy, where our PI is. And then we were going to a conference in San Francisco. So he got some wine lists in San Francisco so we could go to a restaurant in San Francisco and have it make recommendations. But you got to scale. And you know, to really use it and depend on it, you need all these other things. You need explanation, you need provenance, you need some UI considerations. You know, I did it for a big screen and then I got to get it on a phone. So now the interface needs to change. But a lot of things have to change. But the big thing is we've got to populate it. So now, next slide. And how did I do that? Well, I did the semantic web methodology, basically start with a use case. I've got this template up. This template for a use case, we've published it. We've got it in our book, the Ontology Engineering book, but it leverages, you know, NIST use case template. It leverages a lot of other people's use case template. And the semantic web methodology is kind of this cycle where, what are you trying to do? And let's actually have a small and mixed team build these things, and let's kind of fail fast, prototype quickly, and kind of go around this and build this out. But and create some competency questions so we know when the application is successful and when we can stop. And so I use this methodology. Probably most people on this call use something like this methodology to build their ontologies and their ontology-enabled applications. But now let's think about an alternative approach, which I think is the next slide. So what if we use LLMs? So if you had really good eyesight, you could see a little picture of Jan's that he asks an LLM, he asks ChatGPT, what would be a possible ontology for wine? And this is an answer that he got. An ontology for wine could include the following classes and properties. And so here's some classes. Wine, the overarching class encompasses all types of wines: red wine, white wine, sparkling wine, fortified wine, grape variety, vineyard, winery, region, with little descriptions. And then the next slide shows some of the properties. And these properties are very interesting to me because this is exactly the terminology that I had in the wine and food ontology that I did for classic and early description logic, and that we published in Ontologies 101. And by the way, this stuff has been on the web for a really long time. So has color, has flavor, has body, has tannin, actually wasn't in mine, that got added, has acidity, has alcohol content. You know, much of this is literally trained, I believe, trained off of my ontology. And there's this ontology is in probably documents. So it's in the tutorial for the web ontology language. It's in the Wine 101. It's in a series of semantic tutorials that Elisa Kendall and I gave. It's in our book. You know, it's been on the web for a long time. So it's not surprising that ChatGPT and other large language models have found it. But it's a nice example of, let me get starting points for the terminology that I need. If you come to our book, you know, one of the chapters in here is how do you get the terminology, and also how do you find ontologies as starting points. So this doesn't point to the ontology as a starting point, but it points to the vocabulary that you might start with. And then next slide. So yeah, it appears that it's essentially my ontology from the Living with Classic paper. And Living with Classic is how do you get started with a limited description logic? And then I gave this pretty extensive example using the wines and food setting to show how you would represent, how you would use every constructor in the language to represent something that made sense in the wine setting. But Jans then looked at what he got back and said, you don't have that much information about flavors, which is true. I don't have that much information about flavors in that ontology. So he says, well, let me get the LLM to see what I might add. So then it says, well, here's some fruit flavors, here's some spice flavors, it adds some other flavors. So he gets some content there. You know, so Jans is like the perfect person to be playing here. So he's super semantic technology literate. He's pretty wine literate. He's actually one of my wines and food friends. And he's also a massive hacker, despite the fact that he's a CEO. You know, he still hacks in his quote spare time. So he didn't just ask ChatGPT to answer his questions. He said, you know, give it to me in Python lists. And he, you know, he's a smart prompt engineer person as well. So he gets a starting point. He says, well, it's missing something I want, so let me go out and see how I can fill that in. He uses the large language model to help fill that in. Now, next slide. And so that was figuring out other potential value restrictions like the flavors. But now let me also figure out what kind of grapes are important. So he likes Bordeaux. So he says, or actually he says, you know, get me some grape varieties. So this comes back with the 30, quote, most important grapes used in making wine. I'm not sure how we evaluate those most important, but, you know, again, it's a starting point. Now, next slide. And then, you know, let's focus in on something. And so one of the things that my ontology does is for particular areas, it says, what are the value restrictions that can go in there? So what type of grapes can be used in Bordeaux? This is a pretty good list. I don't know whether it's an exhaustive list. I should have looked that up, but it's a pretty good list. So again, it's like a starting point. It's probably mostly right. And then you need to vet it. Next slide. And then let me find some wine. So this is where the large language models can really excel. The population, that can take a long time. It's one thing, you need somebody like me and a lot of the people on this call, people who are experts at figuring out how to do the conceptual modeling and how to figure out where you draw the line for what you are and aren't going to include. But when you go to really scale up and do the population, that's labor intensive work that an LLM is a great place to do the initial population that you're still going to vet. So let's keep going. Next slide. So I loved his approach, and actually he and I are working on a paper that expands this even further. And his approach, it provides one example of a human and a generative AI approach that leverages ontologies as starting points. One of the things it doesn't do, or he didn't ask it to do, I should have asked it to, of find me the ontologies as starting points. It really found the vocabulary, and then it gave him the vocabulary. And then it shows a human-driven refinement. So he adds some flavors. And it's a great use of LLMs for population. So he does this for the value restrictions and for some instances. And then it continues to populate different values. And actually, one of the things he populates, I didn't put a slide in for it, is he populates tangent values. But then, how do we know whether this is really true? So he did a cute little experiment with some validation where he looked at the values and then said, okay, ChatGPT or something else, let me find evidence for or against whether, this particular Bordeaux has a high tannin value. So, that gets the evaluation piece, I think, is a place that he started, but that still needs work. And, you don't want to do that manually, but you can semi-automate that. But I think that this kind of exploration is what our field would benefit from. And this is just, like one place. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so do we take some lessons from this? And do we have some discussion from this? And I'm looking at my time. Okay, because I've got one more example sandbox. And yeah, that is why context and prior knowledge are good filters. Yes, absolutely. So I believe that we would be unwise if we don't think about how these language models can enhance some aspects of, ontology-enabled knowledge graph design and population. Having, Jans was probably overkill. I mean, he's like super skilled in a lot of things, but having at least a somewhat skilled human in partnership with the LLM is probably required for now. And then, I think there's a lot of ways that we can discuss how to leverage the LLMs. But what I like to do when I figure out what I'm going to spend my time on, because, we have limited time and resources, and at least at this point in my career, the motto of RPI, I don't know whether the new president's going to change it, but the previous president had the motto of RPI being, why not change the world? At this point in my career, I really want to do projects that change the world. Because, I don't think I'm going to be spending the next 50 years doing ontology work. So I want to make a lasting difference. So let's figure out pain points where we think that our technology, maybe in combination with another technology, can really make a difference. And I think that when I moved from Bell Labs, where I was doing kind of foundational description logic work, to Stanford to run the knowledge system, co-run initially the knowledge systems lab and later run it, I called myself like Dr. Ontology because I did ontologies are us. But now I call myself Dr. Hybrid because like everything I do is a hybrid system. Leveraging the tools in my toolbox, which are ontologies and knowledge graphs and explanation, but also leveraging the other tools that are emerging that have value. So I think if I open it to discussion now, I'll probably spend the rest of the time discussing this. I want to do one more sandbox and then I'm going to go to discussion. Okay, next slide. So we did this other sandbox at RPI. Now we're calling it the Tetherless World Constellation, which is what I run with Jim Hendler. We initially called it Chat BS for bullshit checking these chat programs, but now we call it the Large Language Model Knowledge Graph Fact Checker Demo. And you can submit your questions. We use the Open API, completion API. You can submit a number of, you can submit the question up to 10 times. And it's really important to submit it multiple times because often you get different answers. And then we link it to a structured resource. We link it to Wikidata. And then we, oh yeah, I like the Chat BS term too, but yeah, I'm reading these little blurbs as they pop up. But you know, we're trying to be socially acceptable. Oh, and actually that little icon with the little bowl with the Chat BS, yeah, right there. So I gave a talk at the Knowledge Graph conference this year, and they did this super cool thing. They had an artist in real time writing, making a picture of my talk. And one of the things when I talked about Chat BS, so the author did that, the artist did that, and he told me that I could use this. So it's now the icon for our application, which I really liked. So anyway, you can submit the query up to 10 times, and then we'd have some nice prompt engineering behind the scenes. Jamie McCusker is the lead person who did the prompt engineering piece of this demo. And to try to be, you know, a helpful assistant in answering the questions. And we started this with Chat GPT 3.5, which actually made way more mistakes. So RPI happens to be the oldest technological university in the United States. Chat GPT 4 gets that, but 3.5 used to make a lot of mistakes. But then we extract the entities, we link them to a structured resource. You could use anything, but we use Wikidata. And then you can go in and see what Wikidata knows about it. And the newer versions also let you do a step-by-step explanation. And the newer versions use Google's fact-checking to see whether there's evidence for the answer. But you know, we wanted to really, oh, and then you can also dump it in JSON LD, and you can do RDF generation, and yeah, that's it for this slide. So I'm not saying that this is like the be all and end all of exploration sandboxes, but something like this gives a place where you can interactively play. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so it asked, we asked it who I am, and it gave, and actually this is from ChatGPT 4. And these are all distinct and mostly correct, actually quite correct. But I think in the next slide we've got, oh yeah, and so then we asked it something that is like all over the web, and it's not recent. So when did I work at Stanford? It's got, yeah, it didn't get any of these right. Oh, well, one was close. No, actually none of them were right. And some of them were like way off, and they're all, and this isn't just in one place. It's kind of all over the web. So it's not like it couldn't have gotten it. And this is just simple that we can go check out. And, you know, if you look at Wikipedia, you can definitely get this information from. And then I think go for another one. Next slide. I love this one. You can't get it anymore. ChatGPT 4 realizes that, oh yeah, that the previous one was 4. This one's 3.5. So it said I won the Turing Award. Super cool. But you know, like I didn't, this guy actually, Jack won it. But it's interesting. I've co-authored papers with a bunch of people with some number of people who have won the Turing Award, but I've never written anything with him. And it, you know, it had me at MIT, it had me at all these other places. Oh yeah, and I also won Computers in Thought according to this round. But then if you ask a follow-up question, did I win it? Which I think is the next slide. It knows that I didn't. So, you know, they're not consistent. No, I didn't win the Turing Award. But then actually, I got to have dinner with this year's Turing Award winner, and I told him this, and he's like, "Oh yeah, ChatGPT told me that I won it earlier too." And so now I'm waiting for that Turing Award. Maybe maybe it's just a forecasting. But next slide. Oh yeah, so the new one, now it kind of backpedals so much. I couldn't find the specific information. Well, actually, there's a lot of information about the awards that I've won. You know, it's on the AAAI website, it's on the AAAS website, it's on the Knowledge Graph Conference website. So, and some of these are not recent. I mean, I did win the Knowledge Graph Lifetime Achievement Award after the training period, but I won these other ones before it. So it had plenty of time, but now you're kind of seeing the guardrails. And we're wondering how much we've pounded this. We've given talks, both Jim Hendler and I have given a number of talks on this with a number of different examples. We're wondering how much it's learning from our pounding on the system with these. But, you know, I think that, yeah, forecasting, definitely. I like Douglas Miller's example. I'm going for forecasting. Next slide. So this is the architecture that we use. You know, there's a lot of different architectures that people could use for this. So the user prompt goes in, there is some prompt engineering behind the scenes. We do this continuation effort. The entity extraction and entity linking, there's a little bit of nice stuff there. And you want to connect it to some kind of structured content. Wikidata is our choice, but it could be anything. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to use this architecture, but using some architecture that explores the emerging technology and your technology, I think is what many of us, maybe not all of us, but what many of us should be using. Let's go to the next slide. So, lessons and discussion. I think our context-aware large language model exploratory sandbox, it's just one example. I think all of us, okay, yeah, recent paper that evaluates whether the LLM knows it's hallucinating. Well, that's interesting, but a lot of them, I haven't read that paper, but a lot of times the answer sounds super positive, like it's very authoritative, but you wonder how much of that is the language that it's trained on, that's a very authoritative language, or whether it has some internal evaluation. And I don't know about the internal evaluation. But I think really the sandboxes and the evaluation harnesses are something that our field needs. You know, for the last, I guess 27 years, I've done externally sponsored research. You know, largely government-sponsored research, but some company-sponsored research. And at Bell Labs, I did internally funded research. You know, if you're a DARPA player, it's all about metrics, metrics, metrics. And I have not seen adequate metrics yet. And actually, you know, one of the things that I think holds back the ontology world is we don't have great metrics. You know, like if you go look at the ontology portals, you know, they collect information that it's easy to get, how many downloads, how recent it's been updated, how many classes, how many properties, sometimes how many people point to it. I've got a collaboration with somebody here at RPI on data sharing, you know, how often has something been shared? LLMs are flaky. Yeah, if you're lucky, they're great. If not, yeah, I agree. They're flaky, but they can be usefully wrong. And they can be usefully right. And so, you know, could we then ask the large language model for suggestions? I think I've got 3 more slides that I'm going to go before discussion. Okay, next slide. So I said, hey, ChatGPT, what are unsolved problems in formal ontology research? Actually, I did this one in preparation for the FOIS talk for formal ontologies and information systems. And, you know, these answers are decent. Ontology alignment, evolution, modularization, evaluation. Next slide, because it went on. Learning and population. And the learning and population, or at least the population, I think is one place that the LLMs can really help. Reasoning scalability, I don't think it's going to help at all. Uncertainty and vagueness, well, maybe. Visualization, well, we definitely need work there. And then this is just what ChatGPT said. But I think, next slide. So I think we as a community should brainstorm about how and when it makes sense to use these technologies. And I just pulled out some from what ChatGPT said, but then what are your pain points? You know, I've got a few pain points of my own. So I guess I don't have that many sandboxes that I stand on these days, but one of them is use cases. I think use cases are really important to scope your project, to focus your project, and competency questions are really important, but they're hard to generate a good set of competency questions that have adequate depth and breadth. So that's one of my pain points. Good benchmark generation, I'm working on that in Common Sense, in the Common Sense Reasoning program. I'm working on that everywhere. Use case generation in general, not just competency questions, and finding good starting points for the ontologies. One of my projects, I run the data science core of the data center award for a large exposure and health project for the National Institute of Environmental Health Science. So I was in charge of doing an ontology for all of exposure science, like everything you breathed and ate, and everything that your parents did and gave to you, and then every health outcome that you've got. So like all of exposure and all of health. Well, I'm not going to be an expert in all of that. So we looked at about 150 ontologies, and we categorized, you know, when we were going to use them, under what conditions, and we had all these metrics for how to evaluate them. That was really time consuming, and I couldn't get, you know, like a low-level graduate student to do that. Trying to do the exploration for starting points, finding them is one thing that we can do. Evaluating them is definitely more. Okay, I think the next slide, I'm going to go to questions. Or actually, you know, my take-home messages are collaboration is key. And I went to a talk for medical doctors by the new dean of the medical school at UT Austin. And she said a version of this sentence for the doctors. She said, AI will not replace doctors, but doctors who do not collaborate with generative AI will be replaced. I modified it to, it's not going to replace knowledge professionals. It won't replace most knowledge professionals, but many knowledge professionals who do not collaborate in smart, informed ways will be replaced, or at least won't realize the potential that they could otherwise realize. And I think the generative AI explosion provides us with a platform and a unique opportunity to shine, because how are these things going to represent the meaning of terms and put context on things? So I think it's time to leverage this and rethink our methods. And with that, I think I've got 11 minutes for questions. Oh, and I haven't been watching the chat. I've just been watching what popped up on Andrew's screen. So I haven't really been watching the chat.
So Deborah,
Yes.
this is Todd. One of the, in your earlier slide, I think you demonstrated very clearly that chat or generative AI can help with ontology development, refinement, and other things. But what about the converse? Are you considering any experiments where you could use a foundational ontology, Dolce, BFO, or something to aid in the transformers?
Yeah, well, you could, I guess, call this part of prompt engineering. And actually, is it Claude? I think Claude's the one that you can give more background to than anything else. You know, we are exploring different ways of telling it what we want, and, you know, what we want the output to be, and what we want it to be consistent with, and in the style of, so
but
we have asked it to be compatible with.
Well, I'm thinking about the input, the actual ingestion of the data in the first place. Are there any experiments that, because some of the confusion may come from the fact that the probabilistic inferences it's drawing are incurred because of this confusion among the terms that are used. So are there any experiments you're aware of that might use, you know, a foundational ontology or some other ontologies perhaps to help with the ingestion?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but I like that idea. And actually, you know, I don't think I would go first to a broad thing like Dolce, you know, I think I would go more to a mid-level ontology. I think you'd have better results with something more
Oh,
focused.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I like that. But no, I'm not aware of that. Is anybody else?
A related comment or question that might fit in here is one of the things that I like to do with upper ontology is distinguish contextually relative things, quiet entities, things in a role, whatever you want to call them, in that particular mid-level ontology. And this is something that I think certainly pre-LLM, any text extraction stuff struggles with, is knowing when you're talking about a relative notion like a client or a customer rather than a person. And winemaking is a fantastic example where there happen to be labels for these relative things. There's terroir as a wine context specific notion of land. There's vintage is time in the context of wine. There's varietal as species in the context of wine. And as long as your wine ontology is just totally in the context of wine, you didn't need to call out that relativity. But if you want to integrate with hotels and bread and pizzas and whatever, how do we get LLMs ever, or maybe we can't, to ever kind of handle that contextual relativity and be able to link into those, you know, upper ontology or top level ontology terms that make that distinction?
Yeah, that's a good question and a hard question. And, you know, I've got 3 of my students, actually almost all of my students are doing either explanation or context or both. And I think I'm going to be doing explanation and context for the rest of my career, because how do you really make sense of this stuff? And how do you know when to strongly trust it in an important topic if you don't really understand the context? And sometimes the context really needs the nuances. And I don't see how large language models are ever going to do that. I mean, you know, we in the formal world, I don't think most of us would claim that we have solved context. And I don't see how they're going to do it. So, yeah, you know, we might get closer. You know, I got into provenance research because at Stanford, I inherited a couple of multi-million-dollar programs, along with, you know, big payroll. And I had somebody come up to me, one of my funders come up to me and say, I don't care how beautiful your reasoning systems are. I don't care how great your ontology is. If I don't know where the information came from and what you're depending on, you're not going to get your money. So I'm like, well, I just turned into a provenance researcher. So, and an explanation researcher. I always was an explanation researcher, but I got more motivation for doing that. And so, you know, I don't know how many ways, how many technologies you can use to save yourself, but transparency is one of the best techniques I'm aware of. And transparency includes my assumptions and what context I was trained in and, you know, what I was trying to do. You know, when I built this little wines and food thing, all I was trying to do was represent enough about the wine to do a food pairing. And then it kind of expanded from there.
Now, the best applications of LLMs are for machine translation. That's where they were in the beginning, and they still do excellent work in translating from natural languages to and from artificial languages. But the problem is that there is no way to evaluate. They do not do any reasoning. They might copy somebody else's reasoning and apply that, but they can't really do any reasoning on their own. They cannot do any evaluations on your own, so that there's no way to control these things. The applications that we've been doing with our company is to use them as a subroutine. You always have to have a reliable system that controls the LLMs, and you never let them to be in control. They can never be trusted if the LLM is in control. You always have to have some other system, a very solid, reliable reasoning system that controls them, and just never, ever let those things run on their own.
Yeah, I think you said it more strongly than I might have said it. I mean, I like doing some work before I use them, calling them as a subroutine. and then checking out, before I rely on it, doing my own evaluation, which might have my own subroutines as well, and check it against some reliable source. I don't know that Wikidata is the best reliable source, but it's a nice, freely available, structured source that is often right. So I also wouldn't want to have them in control of anything, but I'm willing to rely on them for things that are not of critical importance. So find me some terminology for the wines ontology. I'm willing to get that as a starting point, knowing that they're going to miss some things and they're probably going to give me some garbage. But what it gave Jans was actually pretty darn good. But of course, what it gave Jans was an awful lot of my work and other people's work. But I can see. I should have asked him, because I had a couple of weird nuances in my first publication of that ontology, because I wanted to have kind of a lattice of color, body, sugar, and flavor for certain regions, and I needed an Italian wine with a certain combination of properties. So I made this thing called McGuinness, which, just trying to make McGuinness kind of sound Italian. If anything ever comes back with that, I know it's mine. And my mother's maiden name, I needed a German wine with particular properties, so I put her maiden name in there too. So we'll see whether that ever surfaces. But I'm in general agreement with what John just said. I think you just made it a little bit stronger than I would go on a platform with. There's probably some questions in the, we only have 2 minutes left. All right, maybe I yield to Andrea for how to best use the last 2 minutes.
Well, what I would recommend is that for people who want to keep discussing these things, we do it on the mailing list, the Ontolog Forum mailing list that people see. I think there's a lot of synergy with the things you talked about, Deborah, and the upcoming sessions too that we're going to be having. And none of the sessions, I think, will ever claim that an LLM is sufficient as the single technology you use. But I think all of them talk about the hybrid, your doctor hybrid approaches of using things together, using ontology, using LLMs to help with different things, to help people like use Sparkle to access ontological or knowledge graph data, doing all these different kinds of approaches. So the discussion is amazing. All of the problems, though, are true around the world. Like, as Todd pointed out, we don't really know what context is ourselves sometimes. So, I mean, the LLM won't either. So I would encourage people to put in questions, to dialogue, to keep coming to these sessions, because everybody's going to be raising different points. Tony Steele, Everin Sarin from Stardog, all these places. And I would love for people to participate more and ask questions, and especially at our last session, which will be on November 15th, which is, let's try to pull together where we are.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Andrea, hold on, Ravi. If I may, one last question for Deborah, for you to consider. Deborah, what would a meta chat GPT be like?
Oh, I love this. Yes, I'm doing we're doing work on Meta Explainer. Meta chat or I love that. And actually there are some meta approaches right now where one LLM asks another LLM for verification or refinement or something. But what I really want in a meta is I want the synthesis. And these things are, as John and everyone is saying, they don't synthesize. They might repeat somebody else's synthesis, but they don't synthesize. Yeah, and I just noticed that Ravi's hand was up too. And sorry, Ravi, I didn't see you earlier.
Just a quick one. How aware are LLMs of images and graphic information?
Oh, well, that's growing. there's a new one. There's a few that are really starting to train on the images. I'm not an expert on that. But yeah, that's starting to explode, and actually voice as well.
And the other comment is that some languages have built-in context awareness, like Sanskrit. Just FYI. And the name is Hans Asman. Hans means the bird that flies like a swan. So just correcting Hans's name.
It's Jans with a J.
Yeah, it's with a J. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Very great talk. Lot to think of. And please come so we can ask you more questions.
Yeah, I'll be at 10 AI next week during this, but I'll come the following week. And then the next 2 weeks I'm at the International Semantic Web Conference and the Semantic Web and Knowledge Graph Conference in Spain. So if anybody's there, come see me.
Also, everybody, we do record these. So even if you can't make the session, you can still kind of come back and watch it.
Yes.
Well, this was fun. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. And I will definitely look at the questions in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. And kindly make your slides available to us.
They're noted already. I think they're on the fall series session page already, Robbie.
Thank you.
The slides are already posted. They were posted before the meeting.
Yeah, and the slides actually have the whole, I gave a keynote at Voice. They have most of the Voice content at the end as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Deborah, I want to thank you so much for this. And I want to thank everybody who attended another amazing session. And let's keep the discussion going. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.